The first snow of November had just begun to fall over the quiet valley of Red Creek, a forgotten village nestled between the rust-red cliffs of the Arizona Territory. The year was 1887, and the world beyond those canyons was changing fast. Railroads cutting through old trails, strangers coming with silver dreams and paper promises. But in Red Creek, time still seemed to move slow, tied to the rhythm of horses' hooves and the flicker of oil lamps. The air smelled of pine smoke and dust, and the only sound that broke the stillness was the crackle of fire from the old trading post near the edge of town. Inside that trading post, beneath the dim glow of a lantern, sat a girl with trembling hands and eyes too deep for her years. Her name was Clara. She had come down from the hills after her father passed in the spring, looking for work, for shelter, for anything that could quiet the hollow ache of being alone. Red Creek had never been kind to women like her, young, poor, and without kin. Most looked away when she passed by, whispering of her father's debts and the way her family's cabin had burned under suspicious light. Across from her stood a man the townsfolk only spoke of in half-truths. He went by Eli. Some said he had been a soldier, others claimed he had Apache blood in his veins. Whatever the truth, no one dared question him. His silence carried weight, the kind that made even the sheriff choose his words carefully. He had a face marked by the desert sun, and eyes that seemed to see through the lies people told to survive. When Clara first met him, she hadn't meant to stay long. She'd come to buy flour and salt and maybe a few candles if she had enough coins left. But the moment Eli's gaze found hers, something in her stilled. There was no judgment there, no pity, just a strange, steady quiet that made her chest tighten. He'd asked where she was staying, and she'd lied, saying she had a place up by the ridge. He didn't believe her, and she knew it. That night, as the wind swept through the valley, Eli had found her again, curled up behind the old barn near the creek, shivering beneath a torn blanket. He hadn't spoken at first, just stood there, a dark outline against the pale snow, before finally tossing her his coat and saying, "You'll freeze before morning if you stay out here." She had followed him without a word. His cabin sat farther up the slope, where the forest thickened and the river's song was a constant murmur through the night. It wasn't much. A single room, a stove that smoked too much, and a cot made from rough timber, but it was warm, and to her, it felt like a church. She'd sat by the fire, watching the shadows move across the walls, while Eli poured her coffee in a tin cup. "You don't owe me anything," he'd said quietly when she tried to thank him. "Just rest." And yet, the silence between them carried a weight neither could escape. Days passed like that. He would head out before dawn, hunting or cutting wood, and she would tend to the fire, mend torn shirts, sweep the floor that never seemed clean. She told herself she would leave once she earned enough to move on. But where could she go? The nearest town was 2 days' ride through open country, and she had no horse, no friends, no reason. There was a kindness in Eli that unsettled her. He never asked about her past, never touched her without reason, but sometimes she caught him watching her, like he was trying to read a book written in a language long forgotten. One evening, a storm rolled in from the south. The sky turned to slate, and the wind moaned through the trees like something alive. Eli came in soaked, his coat heavy with snow, his hair dripping into his collar. Clara had just pulled bread from the fire, and the smell of it filled the room, warm and sweet. He took it without a word, sitting by the fire, the light dancing across his face. She sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, heart thudding softly against her ribs. After a while, he said, "You're not used to being around people, are you?" She looked down. "People don't stay kind for long." He studied her then, his jaw tightening, his eyes dark. "Some don't," he said.
But not all. The storm outside deepened.
Rain turned to sleet, sleet to snow, and the sound of it drumming against the roof filled the silence. She rose to check the latch on the door, but when she turned back, she found him watching her again. Quiet, steady, unreadable. "You shouldn't be afraid here," he murmured, standing slowly. "No one will hurt you in this place." Clara's breath caught. She wanted to believe him, but years of fear had built walls inside her heart. She had seen too many promises break under the weight of men's tempers. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of tobacco and rain on his coat. "No one has ever touched you," he said softly, his voice roughened by something between wonder and sorrow. "And I'll be the first. And the last. The words hung in the air, trembling like the flame between them. He didn't reach for her. He only looked at her, waiting, not demanding, not taking, just waiting. And in that stillness, something old and fragile stirred within her chest. But before she could answer, before she could even breathe, a sharp knock came at the door. Eli turned his head sharply, the softness in his face vanishing like mist. The sound came again, 3 hard raps, then silence. He moved toward the door, hand instinctively resting on the revolver at his side. "Stay back," he whispered. Her pulse raced as she pressed herself against the wall. Through the gap in the wood, she could see the shadow of a man outside, a broad shape under a wide-brimmed hat, snow swirling around him. "Eli," a voice called, muffled by the wind. "Open up, it's urgent," he hesitated. Then slowly he unlatched the door. The man who stepped inside looked like trouble. Mud on his boots, blood on his sleeve, eyes wild with something close to panic. "They're coming," he gasped. "The sheriff's men said they're heading this way. Said there's a woman up here. You're hiding her." Clara's heart froze. Eli's face didn't move, but his fingers tightened around the gun. "You tell them that?" "I didn't have to," the man replied, voice shaking. "They already know. Someone saw her near town." The wind howled outside, flinging snow against the door. Clara felt the floor sway beneath her as the truth sank in. Her past, the one she'd been running from, had finally caught up. Eli turned to her then, his eyes calm, steady, as though he'd been expecting this moment all along. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "If they find you here, they won't ask questions. You understand?" She nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "I never meant to bring trouble to your door." He stepped closer, his voice low but sure. "You didn't. Trouble was already looking for me." Outside, through the storm, the faint glow of lanterns began to flicker in the distance, moving slowly up the trail toward the cabin. Eli reached for his coat, pulling it on in one swift motion, his eyes never leaving hers. "No matter what happens," he said, "you stay behind that wall. Don't move until I come for you." Her hands trembled as she tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He gave her one last look, the kind that said more than words ever could. Then he opened the door and stepped into the storm, the snow swallowing his figure until only the wind remained. Clara stood frozen in the half-light, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The fire crackled low, shadows dancing across the walls, and in that hollow silence she heard his words again. "I'll be the first and the last." Outside, the sound of horses approached, and the night closed in like a secret yet to be told. The storm howled through the night as if the mountains themselves were alive, whispering warnings through the wind. Clara pressed her palms against the cold wall, her breath shallow and quick, listening to the sound of boots crunching over snow outside. The faint glow of lanterns moved closer, shadows flickering against the window pane like restless ghosts. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The cabin was surrounded by thick woods, and even if she escaped, the snow would swallow her tracks and her body with equal hunger. She could hear Eli's voice outside, low and steady, like he was speaking to someone he didn't trust. She couldn't make out the words, only the tone, calm but sharp, the way a knife's edge gleams just before it cuts. The man who'd warned them was still inside, pacing by the fire. His hands were shaking, his eyes darting to the door every few seconds. "They'll shoot him," he muttered under his breath. "You don't know these men. Sheriff's got a temper. Don't care who he hits if he thinks you're lying." Clara didn't answer. She couldn't. Every muscle in her body was tight, waiting for the sound of gunfire, for the moment the world outside would break open. She thought of the last time she'd heard shots, months ago before she left the hills. That sound had taken her father's life and the only home she'd ever known. Outside, the wind carried a voice, someone shouting Eli's name. Then silence. The minutes dragged like hours before Eli finally stepped back inside, his coat dusted with snow, his jaw clenched tight. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, breathing hard. "They're not coming in," he said finally, though his voice didn't sound relieved. "Not yet." The man by the fire swallowed hard. "What did you tell them?" "That she's gone," Eli said. "That she left 2 days ago, heading north." Clara's heart sank. The lie might buy them time, but not safety. Men like the sheriff didn't stop once they started looking. She had seen it before, the way suspicion turned good men cruel. Eli turned toward her then. His eyes met hers, steady but filled with something heavier now, something like regret. "You can't stay here anymore," he said quietly. I don't have anywhere else to go, she whispered. He hesitated, rubbing a hand across his face. The light from the fire threw long shadows across the room, and for the first time she noticed how tired he looked. Lines cut deep into his skin, the mark of someone who'd lived too many lives already. You shouldn't have to keep running, he said, almost to himself. But they won't stop. They think you know something. Her brow furrowed. Know something? About what? Eli didn't answer right away. He walked to the window and lifted the edge of the curtain, watching the dark beyond. Your father, he said after a long pause. There was talk he'd found something before he died. Something people wanted. Clara froze. That's not true. He didn't have anything, just debts. Eli turned toward her slowly, his eyes searching her face. Maybe so, but that fire that took your house, it wasn't an accident. I heard stories in town before you ever showed up here. Men whispering about gold up in the hills. A map gone missing. Your father was the last one seen near the old claim before it burned. Her stomach turned. She wanted to tell him it was nonsense, that her father wasn't that kind of man. But doubt crept in. There had been nights she'd woken to him muttering over his ledger. Strange markings scrawled across the pages she was never allowed to see. She'd thought it was just numbers. More debts, more worries. But what if it had been something else? The man by the fire let out a shaky breath. If the sheriff thinks she's got that map, he won't stop till he finds her. You know that. Eli's eyes darkened. That's why she's leaving tonight. Clara's throat tightened. In this storm? I won't make it a mile. He looked at her for a long time before speaking. You won't be alone. The man by the fire stared at him. You can't go with her. You'll be signing your death warrant. Eli ignored him. There's a cabin past the ridge near Old Miller's Pass. It's half buried, but there's food, a stove, and a dry place to hide. You stay there until I say otherwise. Clara opened her mouth to argue, but the sound of horses outside cut her short. Lantern light spilled through the cracks again. Closer now, brighter. Someone shouted Eli's name once more, followed by the metallic click of a rifle being cocked. Eli grabbed his hat and the rifle leaning by the wall. We move now. The next few minutes blurred into motion. He threw a blanket over her shoulders, stuffed what food they had into a sack, and pushed open the back door that led into the woods. The cold bit through her skin like knives, the snow rising almost to her knees. But Eli's hand was steady on her back, guiding her forward. Behind them, voices echoed through the storm, men calling out, boots crunching in unison. Lanterns swayed like restless stars among the trees. Go, Eli hissed. Stay low. They slipped into the forest, the wind swallowing their tracks faster than they could make them. Clara could barely breathe, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. Branches whipped against her face, the darkness closing in on every side. After what felt like hours, Eli stopped beside a fallen pine, scanning the distance. The lights were still faint behind them, moving slow but steady. He crouched beside her, breath steaming in the cold. They won't give up tonight, he said. We'll circle east, then cut across the ridge before daylight. She nodded, though her body was trembling too hard to speak. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small metal locket. Your father gave this to me once, he said softly. Said it was for his girl if he never made it back. Her eyes widened as he placed it in her hand. The metal was cold, heavy, and when she opened it, a tiny folded piece of paper sat inside. A rough sketch, faint and yellowed with age. It wasn't a picture, it was a map. She stared at it, her breath catching. This can't be real. Eli's voice was low. Whatever it is, others believe it's worth killing for. Before she could reply, a gunshot cracked through the trees. The sound echoed like thunder, and both of them dropped low to the snow. A second shot followed, closer this time. The voices were louder now, shouting orders. Eli grabbed her hand. Move! They ran through the trees, branches clawing at their coats, snow spraying beneath their boots. The night blurred into wind and breath and fear. When they finally stopped, it was near the edge of a frozen creek, the moon breaking through the clouds just long enough to cast silver light on the ice. Eli crouched beside her, his voice barely a whisper. They'll split up soon. When they do, we cross the creek. It'll cover our scent. Clara nodded, clutching the locket to her chest. The wind carried the sound of men calling again, but fainter now, scattered by the storm. After a long silence, she looked at him. Why are you helping me? He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the first pale glow of dawn was fighting through the clouds. Because I owe your father, he said finally. And because you remind me of something I lost a long time ago." She wanted to ask more, but before she could, a voice shouted from the trees behind them, closer than before. Eli turned sharply, his expression hardening. "Go," he whispered. "Now," she hesitated. "Not without you." He met her eyes, the cold wind swirling between them, carrying the unspoken things neither had time to say. "You will," he said quietly. "You have to." Then he rose, stepping out from the shadows with his rifle raised, moving toward the voices. Clara watched him disappear into the trees until only the echo of his footsteps remained. The creek groaned beneath her as she stepped onto the ice, the map still clutched tight in her hand. Behind her, a gunshot tore through the morning air, and then another. She didn't look back. The snow fell heavier now, erasing everything. The tracks, the blood, the trail that had led her here. She didn't know where the ridge was, or whether Eli would ever return. All she knew was that the world she'd thought she'd left behind had found her again. And somewhere in the storm, among the cries and the gunfire and the endless white, his voice lingered in her memory, steady and sure, a promise and a warning all at once. "I'll be the first and the last." The words echoed in her chest as she disappeared into the storm, the map pressing against her heart like the pulse of something alive, something that had only just begun to reveal its truth. The wind had quieted by morning, but the forest still carried the heaviness of the night before. Clara's feet ached from walking, her skirt soaked through with melting snow. The creek she'd crossed was now a pale ribbon behind her, the ice beginning to crack under the weak sunlight. She didn't know how far she had come, only that her legs trembled with every step. Somewhere behind her, smoke rose faintly above the trees, thin and gray. She couldn't tell if it was Eli's doing, or the men still hunting her. She stopped beside a fallen tree and leaned against it, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The locket felt like a weight in her pocket, the paper inside soft with wear. She had opened it again at dawn, tracing the faint lines with numb fingers. It was a map, that much she knew, but the markings made no sense. Just shapes and curves like ridges or rivers, and a small cross drawn near the edge. Her father's handwriting, rough and uneven, marked one word beneath it: Ash Hollow. She didn't remember him ever mentioning such a place. Still, the name stirred something in her, a faint echo of a story told long ago about a mine that had been sealed after men vanished inside. She wondered if this was what they thought she knew, the location of something that had cost lives and sanity alike. By noon, the snow had melted enough for her to move faster. The land sloped upward into a ridge covered in tall pines, their needles dripping in the weak sunlight. She could see far across the valley now. No riders, no smoke, no movement except the river cutting through the trees below. But the quiet didn't comfort her. It only made her more aware of how alone she was. Her stomach tightened with hunger. She'd eaten the last crust of bread hours ago, and the cold had stolen most of her strength. She thought of Eli then, the way his voice had sounded when he told her to run, the steady calm in his eyes even when danger closed in. She didn't know if he'd survived. The thought that he might have stayed behind for her made her chest ache. She kept walking until she found a small clearing where the ground was dry enough to rest. She knelt beside a stream, cupping water into her hands, the cold biting her skin. The silence was broken only by the faint rustle of branches behind her. She froze. "Don't turn around," a voice said softly. It wasn't Eli's voice. A figure stepped out from the trees. A woman, older, her hair streaked with gray and her eyes sharp as flint. She held a rifle low at her side, not aimed but not relaxed either. Her coat was patched, her hands rough from years of work. "You're a long way from the trail," the woman said, watching her. "Who sent you up here?" Clara swallowed, her throat dry. "No one. I'm just trying to get north before the snow gets worse." The woman studied her for a long moment. "You've got that look of someone being followed. You best come inside before you freeze." Clara hesitated. The woman's voice wasn't unkind, but there was no warmth in it either. Just the steady tone of someone used to hiding from the world. "I don't want trouble," Clara said carefully. The woman snorted. "Trouble finds everyone eventually." She gestured toward a cabin hidden behind the trees. Smoke rose from its chimney and the faint smell of stew drifted through the air. Clara followed slowly, every step wary, though the promise of warmth pulled her forward. Inside, the cabin was small but tidy, shelves lined with jars, a stove glowing in the corner, and a single table covered in worn maps and papers. The woman motioned for her to sit. "Name's Ruth," she said, ladling stew into a tin bowl. Haven't had company up here in months. You can eat, but you'll tell me the truth when you're done." Clara's hands trembled as she lifted the spoon. The food was hot and rich, the first real meal she'd had in days. When she finished, Ruth sat across from her, watching closely. "So," Ruth said, "who's after you?" Clara stared into the fire, her voice small. "The sheriff's men. They think I have something that doesn't belong to me." "Do you?" She reached into her pocket, pulling out the locket. Ruth's eyes narrowed as she unfolded the small piece of paper inside. The moment she saw it, something flickered in her face. A recognition she tried to hide. "Where'd you get this?" Ruth asked, her tone sharper now. "My father left it. Before he died." Ruth leaned back, her eyes clouding with thought. "Your father wouldn't be Daniel by any chance?" Clara's breath caught. "You knew him?" "I knew of him," Ruth said slowly. "Worked near the mines when they first opened Ash Hollow. Most folks don't talk about that place anymore. Too many bones buried under those rocks." Clara frowned. "What happened there?" Ruth hesitated. The fire popped between them, and for a long moment she didn't answer. "They said it was cursed," she finally said. "Men went in for silver, but they brought something else out. Greed mostly, but also madness. When the cave collapsed, only 2 men came out alive. One of them was your father." The room seemed to grow colder. "He never told me that." "Would you if you'd seen what he did?" Ruth said softly. "There's a reason he burned that cabin. He was trying to bury the past before it buried him." Clara's hands tightened around the edge of the table. "Then what do they want from me?" "The map," Ruth said simply. "That piece of paper could lead a man to what's left of the mine. There's still talk of treasure in those tunnels, enough to make even decent men turn cruel." Clara stared at the locket in her hand, the lines blurring before her eyes. It wasn't just a map. It was a curse passed down without her knowing. Outside, a horse neighed in the distance. Ruth rose instantly, crossing to the window, her jaw tensed. "You said the sheriff's men were after you. How close were they?" Clara stood, fear spiking through her. "They were behind us last night, but I thought we lost them." Ruth cursed under her breath, grabbing the rifle. "They didn't lose you. They followed your tracks here." She moved quickly, dousing the fire and pulling a trapdoor open in the floorboards. "Down there," she ordered. "Stay quiet." Clara climbed down into the dark space, the smell of earth thick around her. Above, Ruth pulled the trapdoor shut just as the sound of boots approached the cabin. Muffled voices followed, a man's drawl, then another deeper and more commanding. "We're looking for a girl," the voice said. "Dark hair, thin, been on the run. You seen her?" Ruth's tone was calm, almost bored. "Ain't seen a soul all week. Storm scared everyone off." The man laughed. "You always were a good liar, Ruth. Shame I know you too well." Clara's heart hammered as she recognized that voice. It was the sheriff himself. Boots scraped across the floor above her. The boards creaked as someone stepped closer to where she hid. She covered her mouth, praying the sound of her breath wouldn't give her away. Then suddenly, another voice joined the mix. Quiet but sharp. "She's not here." Clara's blood ran cold. She knew that voice too. Eli, he was alive. But why was he with them? The sheriff chuckled. "You sure about that, boy? You've been awful quiet since last night." Eli's reply was steady, but there was tension beneath it. "If she'd made it this far, she wouldn't have survived the storm. You're wasting time." The silence that followed was unbearable. Clara couldn't tell if he was protecting her or betraying her. Finally, the sheriff said, "We'll check the woods. If you see her, you know where to bring her." The door slammed shut. The sound of horses faded slowly, swallowed by the wind. When Ruth lifted the trapdoor, Clara climbed out, shaking. "He's with them," she whispered. "He said he told me to run. He wouldn't." Ruth laid a hand on her shoulder. "You don't know what he's doing yet. Maybe he's trying to buy you time." Clara wanted to believe that, but doubt gnawed at her. Ruth glanced at the map still clutched in Clara's hand. "If they find this, there won't be any time left to buy. You need to get to Ash Hollow before they do." Clara looked toward the mountains, their dark peaks cutting into the sky. The air carried the faint scent of pine and smoke. Somewhere out there, Eli was riding with the very men hunting her, and for the first time, she wasn't sure which side he was truly on. She wrapped the locket back around her neck, her resolve hardening like frost. Whatever secrets her father had buried in Ash Hollow, she would have to face them herself. As the sun sank behind the ridge, the world turned cold again, and the forest filled with the sound of horses echoing through the distance, drawing closer, one step at a time. The next morning broke with a sky heavy and gray, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Clara and Ruth had left before sunrise, following a narrow trail that wound north through the pines. The map was tucked safely inside Clara's coat, close to her heart, and every few minutes she'd press her hand against it to make sure it was still there. The snow had hardened overnight, making their steps crunch loudly against the frozen ground. Every sound echoed in the silence, reminding her that they weren't alone in those woods. Ruth walked ahead, her rifle slung across her shoulder. She moved with the sure-footed ease of someone who knew every inch of the land. Clara followed quietly, her thoughts spinning faster than her feet could carry her. The image of Eli riding with the sheriff's men wouldn't leave her mind. His voice, calm and deliberate, replayed over and over. She wanted to believe Ruth, that he was only pretending, but a shadow of doubt followed her like a ghost. When they stopped to rest, Ruth knelt beside a fallen log and unfolded a rough sketch she'd drawn from memory. "We're here," she said, pointing to a bend in the ridge. "Ash Hollow lies just past that ridge, about 5 miles east. But the path splits near the old quarry. If we take the wrong one, we'll end up in the flats, and that's where they'll look first." Clara nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. "You said you worked near the mines once. Did you ever see it yourself?" Ruth hesitated. "Once, long time ago before they sealed it off. The ground there isn't right. You'll see when we get close." The words lingered like frost in the air. They set off again, climbing steadily until the forest began to thin. The higher they went, the quieter it became. No birds, no wind, only the crunch of snow and the beating of her heart. By midday, clouds gathered again, dark and heavy, and the smell of snow filled the air. They reached a narrow ledge overlooking the valley. Below them stretched miles of wilderness, gray trees, frozen creeks, and in the far distance a flicker of movement. Horses. Ruth's eyes narrowed. "They're closing in faster than I thought." Clara's chest tightened. "You think it's them?" Ruth didn't answer, but her expression said enough. She turned quickly, checking her rifle. "We can't stop now. Once they reach the ridge, they'll have us cornered." They pressed on, moving faster, but the wind was picking up, blowing snow into their faces. Clara stumbled several times, her body aching from exhaustion, yet she didn't complain. She couldn't. The fear driving her forward was stronger than the pain. The trail wound into a narrow ravine where the ground was slick with ice. They walked single file, the walls of rock rising steeply on either side. The sound of horses echoed faintly through the canyon, growing closer. Ruth stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. "Listen." Clara strained her ears. Between the gusts of wind, she heard it. A voice, low but distinct. Someone was calling her name. She froze. "Clara." It was Eli. The sound came from somewhere behind them, carried through the canyon. She turned toward the echo, her heart twisting. "Don't," Ruth said sharply. "Could be a trick." Clara's eyes filled with tears she couldn't hold back. "It's him. I know his voice." Ruth's expression softened, but only for a moment. "Maybe, but until we know whose side he's on, we keep moving." They climbed the rest of the way in silence. The voice faded behind them, swallowed by the storm that had begun to thicken. Snow fell hard now, blurring the path until the world seemed made of nothing but white and shadow. As the day wore on, the land began to change. The trees grew sparse and the air felt strange, still and heavy, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The ridge ahead was streaked with black stone, and the entrance to Ash Hollow stood carved into its base like a scar. A ring of old timber framed the opening, half collapsed from years of weather. Ruth stopped at the edge. "That's it." Clara stared at the dark mouth of the mine, her pulse quickening. The air that drifted from inside was cold and metallic, smelling faintly of ash. "Are you sure it's safe?" she asked quietly. Ruth gave a short, humorless laugh. "Safe? No, but it's the only place they won't follow right away. Not if they've heard the stories." She stepped forward, lifting the lantern she carried. The dim flame flickered against the black walls, revealing old support beams and rusted tools scattered across the ground. The deeper they went, the darker it became, until the only light was the small circle around Ruth's hand. The tunnel split in two after several yards. Ruth turned to her. "Stay close. The map, does it show which path?" Clara pulled it out, squinting at the faded ink. "There's a curve here, and something marked just beyond it." She pointed to the left tunnel. "This way." They followed the passage, the air growing colder, heavier. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, steady drops. Their footsteps echoed, overlapping until it sounded like others were walking beside them. Clara's thoughts were racing. Every story Ruth had told about this place replayed in her mind. The men who vanished, the greed that drove them, the madness that followed. She could almost feel her father's ghost here, watching her. After what felt like hours, they reached a wide chamber where the ceiling opened high above. In the center lay a broken cart, half buried in rock and dirt. Something metallic glinted beneath it. Ruth knelt down, brushing away the dust. "Looks like your father wasn't lying," she murmured. Beneath the debris lay a small chest, iron-bound and rusted shut. Clara's breath caught. "What's inside?" Ruth met her eyes. "Only one way to find out." She raised her pickaxe and struck the lock. The sound echoed through the chamber like a thunderclap. It took 2 more blows before the lid creaked open. Inside was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Ruth unfolded it carefully, revealing stacks of old papers, some torn, some water-stained. Beneath them was a leather pouch filled with dull gray stones. "Silver," Ruth whispered. "The real thing." But before Clara could speak, another sound filled the cavern, the distant clatter of boots on stone. Ruth's head snapped up. They found us. The tunnel behind them glowed faintly with the light of approaching lanterns. Voices echoed, men shouting orders, boots pounding closer. "Take the papers," Ruth said quickly. "Go deeper. There's another way out past the lower shaft." Clara hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll hold them off. Go." But before Ruth could move, a shadow appeared in the tunnel. Eli. His coat was torn, his face streaked with dirt and snow. His rifle hung loosely at his side. "Don't shoot," he said, stepping into the light. "I'm alone." Ruth raised her weapon anyway. "You'd better start talking fast." He looked past her, straight at Clara. "They're not far behind me. I tried to turn them the other way, but the sheriff's got a tracker with him. You don't have much time." Clara's eyes filled with relief and confusion. "You're really on our side?" "I never stopped being," he said quietly. "But if we don't move now, none of us are getting out of here." Ruth lowered her gun reluctantly. "There's another exit through the lower tunnel. I'll cover the rear." They started toward the passage, but before they reached it, the sheriff's voice rang out behind them. "Stop right there." Lanterns flooded the chamber, throwing long shadows across the walls. The sheriff stood at the front, his coat flapping in the cold draft, a revolver gleaming in his hand. 3 men flanked him, their faces hard and pale. "Well, look at that," the sheriff drawled. "The girl, the miner, and the runaway soldier, all together." Eli stepped in front of Clara. "You don't have to do this." The sheriff smiled thinly. "Oh, I do. That map you're holding belongs to the law now." Ruth raised her rifle. "Law? You mean greed." The sheriff cocked his gun. "You best lower that, Ruth. Ain't no need for anyone to get hurt." Clara's heart pounded. The map, the chest, the silver. It all shimmered in the lamplight between them, like a curse waiting to choose its victim. Eli's hand brushed hers, a quiet signal. "When I say run," he whispered, "you don't look back." The sheriff took another step forward. "Give it up, Eli. You can't save her." Eli's eyes hardened. "Maybe not, but I can make sure you don't touch her either." Before the sheriff could respond, Ruth fired. The shot cracked through the mine, echoing so loud it seemed to shake the earth. Lanterns swung wildly as the men scattered for cover. "Run!" Eli shouted. Clara clutched the map to her chest and bolted into the tunnel, the roar of gunfire chasing her into the dark. Ruth's voice echoed behind her, fierce and defiant, until it was swallowed by the sound of collapsing rock. The mine groaned, dust raining from the ceiling. Eli caught up to her, grabbing her hand as they ran. The tunnel was narrowing, the air thick with smoke and grit. "Keep going," he yelled. Somewhere behind them, the sheriff shouted her name again, furious and close. The echo of it twisted through the darkness, following her like a shadow that refused to die. They stumbled into a shaft where faint daylight filtered through cracks in the rock. But the ground beneath them trembled, a deep rumble rising from below. Eli looked back, eyes wide. "It's coming down!" Clara turned toward the light, her breath ragged, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. The map slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the ground just as the sound of breaking stone filled the air. The walls shuddered, and in that final instant before everything went black, she heard Eli's voice, low, urgent, and full of something she couldn't name. "Hold on to me." Then the earth split with a roar, and the world disappeared into dust and silence. The silence after the collapse felt endless. For a long moment, Clara couldn't tell if she was alive or buried among the dead. The air was thick with dust, heavy and choking. She tried to move, but her body felt pinned beneath the weight of rock and dirt. Somewhere in the darkness she heard a faint groan. It was Eli. His hand brushed against hers, weak but alive. Relief surged through her chest like a rush of air after drowning. She called his name softly, her voice trembling. "Eli, can you hear me?" A cough came from the shadows, followed by his voice, hoarse but steady. "I'm here, just don't move too fast. The ground's not settled yet." Clara blinked through the dust, squinting toward the faint light above them. A crack in the ceiling let in a small beam of daylight. It was enough to see that they were in a narrow pocket between fallen stones. Ruth was nowhere in sight. The thought struck her like a knife. She called out, her voice echoing through the hollow space, but no answer came. Eli shifted slightly, wincing in pain. "We have to get out before this whole place caves in." Clara reached for the beam of light, her fingers brushing against the cold rock. Together they began clearing the debris, one stone at a time. Each movement sent tiny avalanches of dust down their necks, but they kept going. Time didn't seem to exist down there, only the sound of their breathing and the scrape of rock. When the opening widened enough, Eli hoisted himself up first, then helped Clara through. The cold air outside hit them like a shock. The storm had passed, leaving behind a still pale sky. The ridge was littered with broken timber and rock from the collapsed mine. Smoke curled faintly from the entrance where the lanterns had been crushed. Clara fell to her knees, her lungs burning, and stared back at the ruined hollow. "Ruth," she whispered. Eli stood beside her, his face somber. "She knew the risk," he said quietly. "If it wasn't for her, we wouldn't have made it out." They sat there in silence for a while, the cold seeping through their clothes, the weight of everything pressing down. Then Clara looked at him, eyes red but steady. "We still have the papers," Eli nodded. That means her fight wasn't for nothing. The bundle of documents she'd carried was still clutched in her coat. She unwrapped it carefully, the pages trembling in her hands. They were her father's notes, surveys, ledgers, and letters written in his careful handwriting. The last page was dated 2 days before he disappeared. In it, he'd written about a deal gone wrong, about men who wanted more than silver, and a warning that no one should return to the hollow until the truth was buried with him. Clara folded the letter slowly, tears filling her eyes. He knew what would happen. He tried to stop them. Eli rested a hand on her shoulder. "And you finished what he started." They made their way down the ridge, the forest silent around them. The snow crunched softly under their boots, and the setting sun cast long orange shadows across the ground. The sheriff and his men were gone, either buried in the collapse or scattered. There was no sound of pursuit, no sign of life from the valley below. By nightfall, they reached the small cabin Ruth had built years ago near the river. It stood crooked but solid, smoke still rising faintly from the chimney as though waiting for them. Inside, everything was as Ruth had left it, simple, warm, and filled with traces of her quiet strength. A pot of herbs hung by the window, and a small wooden box sat on the table. Clara opened it and found a folded piece of paper inside, written in Ruth's rough, careful hand. "If you're reading this," it began, "then you made it. Don't waste what you found. The mine isn't a place of riches, it's a warning. People will always dig until there's nothing left, even of themselves. Remember that the land gives only what it can bear." Clara set the letter down, her throat tightening. She looked around the cabin, at the faint traces of Ruth's life, the worn gloves, the map on the wall, the rifle leaning in the corner. It felt like she was still there somehow, watching over them. Eli stoked the fire and poured 2 mugs of warm tea. They sat quietly, letting the heat seep into their bones. After a long silence, Clara spoke softly. "Do you think people will ever stop chasing what they can't keep?" Eli looked into the flames, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe not, but we can choose not to be like them. That's something." Outside, the wind had died, leaving the forest calm and still. The moon rose over the treetops, silver and gentle. Clara leaned back, exhausted but strangely at peace. She thought of her father, of Ruth, and of all the lives tangled in the story of that hollow. For years, the truth had been buried beneath greed and fear, but now at least it had a voice. The next morning, Clara packed the papers into a leather satchel. She had made her decision. "I'm taking this to the township," she told Eli. "People need to know what happened here. They should remember the cost." Eli didn't argue. "You'll have to be careful," he said. "Not everyone will want the truth coming out." "I know," she said. "But it's the only way to stop it from happening again." They left the cabin together, following the river toward the town. The journey was quiet, broken only by the sound of water and birds returning to the thawing woods. When they reached the edge of the valley, they paused to look back one last time. The ridge stood dark against the horizon, hiding the hollow beneath it, a place that had taken so much but also given them a kind of strength neither had known they had. Weeks later, the story of the collapse spread through the nearby towns. Some called it an accident, others whispered about ghosts and curses. But when the documents surfaced, Clara's father's records, the proof of corruption, and Ruth's warnings, people began to see it differently. The mine was sealed for good, and the land was reclaimed by the forest over time. Clara stayed to help rebuild what little remained of her father's name. She spent her days sorting through his papers and her nights writing letters to nearby settlers, warning them of the dangers hidden beneath their feet. Eli stayed too, repairing homes, helping where he could, though the scars on his hands and the quiet in his eyes told his own story. One evening, as they sat outside the cabin watching the sunset, Clara said softly, "You ever wonder what comes after all this?" Eli smiled faintly. "Peace, maybe. Or just quiet. Either sounds good," she nodded, watching the golden light fade over the hills. "Ruth used to say every place keeps a piece of the people who fought for it. Maybe that's true." He looked at her then, his voice low. "Then this land's in good hands." The breeze rustled the pines, carrying the scent of earth and snow. For the first time in years, Clara felt the weight of the past begin to lift. The hollow no longer felt like a curse. It felt like a memory, one she could finally let rest. In the months that followed, life slowly found its rhythm again. The towns rebuilt, the forests healed, and stories of Ash Hollow faded into legend. But sometimes when the wind blew from the north, Clara would think she heard Ruth's voice, soft, steady, reminding her that truth once uncovered never truly disappears. She kept her father's letter in a small wooden box beside the window, next to Ruth's note. It reminded her of where she came from and what she had survived. Each time she read it, she remembered that courage wasn't found in chasing what glittered beneath the ground. It was in facing the darkness and still choosing to believe in light. Years later, travelers passing through the valley would stop to rest by the river and find a small stone marker near the ridge. It bore no name, only a few simple words carved carefully into its surface, for those who stood when others ran. Clara and Eli never spoke much of what happened afterward. Some things didn't need to be explained. They lived quietly, side by side, tending to the land that had once nearly taken everything from them. The seasons changed, and the years slipped by, but the peace they'd found held strong, and though the world around them moved on, the memory of the hollow, the silver, the greed, the sacrifice, remained a quiet echo beneath the soil. It became part of the story of the land itself, a reminder that even in the darkest places, there is always a chance for redemption. When Clara looked out at the valley each morning, she no longer saw loss. She saw everything that had endured, the forest growing back, the river running clear, the light touching the hills. It was proof that even after ruin, life finds a way to return. And in that quiet truth, she found peace at last.